In September 1904, somewhere in the rolling farmland of eastern France, near a small town called Harry, the German army was about to learn a brutal lesson about American ingenuity. They were also about to witness a tactic so unorthodox, so apparently reckless, that it would eventually be banned by the very army that benefited from it. This is the story of marching fire, a technique that shattered 3,000 German tanks across the European theater, and the man who proved that sometimes the craziest idea in the room is actually the smartest one. Let me start with what tank warfare was supposed to look like in 1904. Every army in World War II trained their tank crews the sombrero. You spot an enemy tank, you stop your vehicle, you take careful aim, you fire. This wasn't just American doctrine. The Germans did it, the British did it, the Soviets did it. It was considered the only rational way to engage in armored combat because, well, it made sense. A moving tank is an inaccurate tank. The bouncing, the vibration, the speed, all of it conspired to throw off your aim. So, you stopped, you steadied your gun, and you took your shot. Whoever got their shot off first usually won the duel. But here's the problem with that approach. When you stop, you become a stationary target. And stationary targets die. The German tankers knew this. The American tankers knew this. Everyone knew this. Yet the doctrine remained unchanged because the alternative seemed worse. Firing while moving meant wasting ammunition. It meant missing. It meant burning through shells that took considerable resources to manufacture and transport to the front lines. The bean counters at Ordnance Department had done the math, and the math said, stop and shoot. Captain Jimmy Leach didn't care about the math. Leach commanded Company C of the 37th Tank Battalion, part of the 4th Armored Division in General George Patton's 3rd Army. By September 1904, Leach had been in combat long enough to understand something that the training manuals back in Fort Knox had never quite captured. The manual was written by people who had never been shot at. The manual assumed ideal conditions. The manual assumed you had time to stop and aim. The manual, Leach concluded, was going to get his men killed. Leach had been observing something interesting about the German tanks they faced. The Wehrmacht crews were well trained. They followed their doctrine religiously. They would stop, aim, and fire with Prussian precision. But stopping meant they needed to calculate range. They needed to track their target. They needed that split second of stillness to make the shot count. Leach started to wonder, what if we never gave them that split second? The idea came to be known as marching fire, though that term doesn't quite capture the violence of what Leach's crews were doing. They would charge at German positions at 15 miles per hour, which doesn't sound fast until you remember these were 30-ton Sherman Durs. Tanks bouncing over French farmland. The entire time, they would fire their main guns. Not aimed shots in the traditional sense. They would fire, reload, and fire again while moving at full speed. The 75mm shells would tear out of the barrel while the tank rocked and swayed. The gunners couldn't possibly aim with the precision they'd been taught, but they didn't need to. The tactic relied on a simple mathematical reality. If you're moving at 15 miles per hour and constantly changing direction, the enemy gunner trying to hit you has to calculate your speed, direction, and range, all while you're also firing at them. It's not impossible, but it's dramatically harder than shooting at a stationary target. Meanwhile, you're throwing shells in their general direction at a high rate. You don't need precision when you're firing 3 times as many rounds. Volume of fire compensates for individual accuracy. The Germans were trained to fight tanks that behave predictably. Leach's tanks behaved like angry hornets. They would come screaming across the battlefield, main guns barking continuously, impossible to range because they never stopped moving long enough to be properly targeted. German tankers found themselves trying to track a target that was simultaneously shooting at them, moving unpredictably, and refusing to play by the established rules of engagement. It was psychological warfare as much as tactical innovation. The Wehrmacht crews, accustomed to methodical, calculated warfare, were suddenly facing what appeared to be madmen. The Battle of Harry in September 1944 proved the concept in blood and steel. The German 5th Panzer Army had launched a major counteroffensive, throwing some of their best armored units against Patton's 3rd Army. This wasn't a ragtag collection of second-rate troops. These were experienced panzer crews in Mark IV and Panther tanks, some of the finest armor Germany produced during the war. The Germans outnumbered the American tanks they faced. They had better armor. They had better guns. By every conventional metric, they should have won. Leach's Company C met them with marching fire. The company after-action reports from September 19th through September 29th tell a story that still seems impossible. Leach's tanks destroyed 47 German tanks and armored vehicles. They did this without losing a single Sherman tank to enemy fire in direct combat. Let me repeat that because it sounds like propaganda. 47-0. Other units in the 4th Armored Division started adopting the tactic after word spread about Leach's success. The entire division began using variations of marching fire. By the end of the Aricourt engagement, the American forces had destroyed somewhere between 200 and 280 German tanks, depending on which records you trust. The German 5th Panzer Army was effectively destroyed as a fighting force. They had started the offensive with the expectation of pushing the Americans back. Instead, they were slaughtered. Now, you'd think that when a tactic achieves results like that, the Army would study it, refine it, and incorporate it into standard doctrine. You would be wrong. The Ordnance Department was furious. According to their careful calculations, each tank was allocated a specific number of shells per engagement. Leach's crews were burning through 300% more ammunition than doctrine allowed. The supply officers were having nervous breakdowns, trying to keep the tanks fed with shells. From their perspective, this wasn't innovation. This was chaos. Belton Cooper, who served as a maintenance officer with the 3rd Armored Division, wrote about the tension between the tankers using marching fire and the supply infrastructure in his book, Death Traps. Cooper describes receiving complaints from Ordnance Department officers who couldn't understand why ammunition consumption had skyrocketed. When they investigated, they found that successful tank companies were the ones using the most ammunition. The companies that followed doctrine and conserved ammunition were the ones taking heavy casualties. But the Ordnance Department wasn't just concerned about logistics. There was a genuine fear that the American supply chain, as impressive as it was, couldn't sustain this level of ammunition consumption if every tank unit in Europe started fighting like Leach's Company. The United States was producing staggering quantities of war material, but there were limits. Ships could only carry so much. Trucks could only haul so much. If every Sherman tank crew started tripling their ammunition usage, something would have to give. So the tactic was officially discouraged. Not quite banned in the sense of court-martial offenses, but strongly discouraged through official channels. Training materials continued to emphasize the stop-aim-fire method. Ordnance officers were instructed to counsel tank commanders about ammunition, conservation. The implication was clear. Marching fire was wasteful, dangerous, and not to be encouraged. The tank crews didn't care. They'd seen the results. They'd watched companies that used marching fire come back intact, while companies that followed doctrine got shot to pieces. In Patton's 3rd Army especially, there was a culture of results over regulation. Patton himself was famous for ignoring rules he thought were stupid, and his subordinates followed his example. If marching fire kept you alive and killed Germans, you used marching fire. You could apologize to the supply officers later. Let's talk about why marching fire actually worked, because at first glance it seems to violate everything we know about gunnery. A tank gun in 1944 was not a precision instrument under the best circumstances. The Sherman tank's 75mm gun was effective, but far from perfect. You had to account for range, wind, the temperature of the barrel, the quality of the ammunition, and a dozen other variables. Now add the fact that you're bouncing across uneven terrain at 15 miles per hour. How could this possibly work? The answer lies in understanding what tank combat actually looked like in 1904 France. These weren't duels at 2,000 yards across open desert. Most tank engagements in the European theater happened at ranges of 500 to 800 yards, sometimes closer. The bocage country of Normandy and the rolling hills of Lorraine didn't offer the long sight lines of North Africa. You were often fighting in close country, across fields and through villages, where you might spot an enemy tank at 400 yards and need to make a decision immediately. At those ranges, the inherent inaccuracy of firing while moving mattered less than you'd think. You weren't trying to thread a needle. You were trying to hit a target the size of a house, at ranges where even a poorly aimed shot had a reasonable chance of connecting. And you were firing multiple shots in rapid succession. Your first shot might miss, your second shot might miss, but your third or fourth shot, even fired while moving, had decent odds of hitting a target at 600 yards. Meanwhile, the German tanker trying to kill you was dealing with a much harder problem. You weren't where you'd been when he started his targeting sequence. The Panther tank had a superior gun and better armor than the Sherman, but it couldn't fire that gun accurately if the gunner couldn't track the target. German doctrine emphasized deliberate aim fire from stationary or slow-moving positions. Their excellent optics and gun stabilization meant nothing if they couldn't get a steady firing solution on a target that kept moving erratically. There's also the factor of crew morale and aggression. Tank warfare is fundamentally about violence and nerve. Two steel boxes drive at each other and shoot until one of them explodes. The crew that maintains their composure and continues to fight effectively usually wins. Marching fire was psychologically empowering for American crews because it put them in an offensive mindset. You weren't sitting still waiting to be hit. You were charging forward, firing constantly, taking the initiative. That mental state mattered more than tactical manuals acknowledged. For German crews, facing tanks that used marching fire was demoralizing. They'd been trained to fight a certain way, and suddenly the Americans weren't cooperating. The Wehrmacht had developed a well-earned reputation for tactical excellence, and much of that reputation came from their methodical approach to armored warfare. Marching fire disrupted that methodology. It introduced chaos into a system that relied on order. German after-action reports from Aricourt repeatedly mentioned the aggressive and seemingly reckless behavior of American tank crews, attacking at high speed with continuous fire. Stephen Zaloga, in his book Armored Thunderbolt, analyzes the effectiveness of different American tank tactics during the war. Zaloga points out that marching fire worked best in specific contexts. It was most effective in fluid, mobile warfare where American tanks could use their speed and reliability to close with German positions quickly. It was less effective in static defensive positions or in urban combat where the ranges were too short and the terrain too restricted. Leach understood this instinctively. He used marching fire during offensive operations and modified his tactics when the situation changed. One aspect that often gets overlooked is the quality of American crews by late 1904. These weren't the green troops that had struggled in North Africa in 1942. By the time of Aricourt, American tank crews had been through brutal combat in Normandy. They had learned hard lessons about German tank superiority. They had developed workarounds for the Sherman's deficiencies. They were experienced, confident, and willing to experiment with tactics that gave them an edge. Leach's crews could execute marching fire because they were good enough to reload a 75mm gun in a bouncing tank while traveling at speed. That took skill. The ammunition consumption issue wasn't trivial, despite what it might sound like in retrospect. The United States was fighting a two-ocean war while simultaneously supplying Britain, the Soviet Union, and Free French forces. Every shell fired in France was a shell that had to be manufactured in America, loaded onto a ship, transported across the Atlantic through U-boat-infested waters, unloaded at a port, and trucked to the front lines. The logistics of that supply chain were staggering. When Ordnance Department officers complained about ammunition usage, they weren't being bureaucratic for the sake of it. They were genuinely worried about sustainability. But here's the counter-argument that the tank crews would have made. Dead tankers don't need ammunition. The Sherman tank had acquired a grim nickname among its crews. They called it the Ronson, after the cigarette lighter, because it supposedly lit on fire every time. That was somewhat unfair. The Sherman was actually more survivable than its reputation suggested, but it was absolutely true that a Sherman tank crew facing a German Panther or Tiger was at a severe disadvantage. The Panther's gun could penetrate a Sherman's armor at ranges where the Sherman's gun couldn't even scratch the Panther's frontal armor. Marching fire helped level that playing field. It didn't make a Sherman into a Panther. It didn't fix the fundamental vulnerability of American tank design. But it gave American crews a fighting chance by denying German crews the opportunity to use their superior guns effectively. A Panther that can't get a firing solution is just an expensive target. If using 3 times the normal ammunition load kept your crew alive to fight another day, that seemed like a reasonable trade-off. The tension between tactical innovation and institutional resistance is a recurring theme in military history. Armies are fundamentally conservative organizations. They have to be. They rely on standardization, on everyone following the same procedures, on predictable logistics and training. When someone like Leach comes along and says the manual is wrong, it creates problems. It works for him, sure, but what if everyone tries it and they're not as skilled? What What if the tactic works in France but fails somewhere else? What if it works in 1944 but becomes obsolete in 1945? These were legitimate concerns. The Army couldn't rebuild its entire tactical doctrine around one captain's success, no matter how impressive. Institutional momentum and caution aren't always wrong, but in this case, the institutional response of discouraging marching fire, while simultaneously benefiting from its results, created a bizarre situation where the tactic was officially disapproved but unofficially widespread. Patton's role in this whole story deserves examination. George Patton was many things, most of them contradictory, but he was absolutely committed to aggressive, mobile warfare. His Third Army moved faster and fought harder than almost any other American formation in Europe. Patton didn't care much for logistics, supply officers, or people who told him things couldn't be done. When his tank commanders started reporting extraordinary kill ratios using marching fire, Patton didn't shut it down. He didn't particularly encourage it officially, because that would have created problems with his superiors, but he didn't stop it either. There's a pattern in the Third Army's operations that suggests Patton quietly approved of tactical innovation even when it violated doctrine. His subordinates felt empowered to experiment because they knew Patton valued results. If you won your battles and kept casualties down, Patton didn't ask too many questions about methodology. This created an environment where someone like Leach could develop and refine marching fire without being immediately told to knock it off. The Battle of Aricourt itself deserves more attention because it was the critical proof of concept. The German offensive in September 1904 wasn't a minor skirmish. The Wehrmacht had pulled together significant armored forces, including the 11th and 113th Panzer Brigades, which were equipped with Panther tanks. These were formidable units with experienced crews. The Germans had chosen their ground carefully, launching their attack in terrain that favored defensive operations by the Americans, but which the Germans believed they could overcome through superior armor and firepower. The 4th Armored Division was outnumbered, but had several advantages beyond marching fire. American intelligence was excellent. The Allies had broken German codes and could track Wehrmacht movements with reasonable accuracy. The Americans also had complete air superiority. German tanks moving in daylight were vulnerable to P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers, which could destroy tanks with rockets and bombs. The weather during Aricourt was poor, limiting air operations, but the threat of air attack constrained German maneuvers. When the German attack began on September 18th, the 4th Armored Division was spread out across a wide front. The Germans achieved initial surprise and made some gains, but as American units consolidated and counterattacked, the battle turned into a series of meeting engagements where American mobility and aggressive tactics overwhelmed German firepower advantages. This is where marching fire proved its worth. In fluid, chaotic combat where tanks were maneuvering constantly, the ability to fire effectively while moving was decisive. Individual actions during the battle read like something from a tactical manual, if tactical manuals were written by people who'd lost their minds. American tank platoons would charge German positions at maximum speed, firing continuously, then break through and engage German tanks from the flanks and rear. German tanks attempting to retreat would find themselves pursued by Shermans that never stopped shooting. The psychological impact on German crews was severe. They were accustomed to fighting an enemy that behaved predictably. The Americans at Aricourt behaved like maniacs. By September 29th, when the battle finally concluded, the German 5th Panzer Army had been gutted. They'd lost the majority of their tanks and had failed to achieve any of their objectives. The 4th Armored Division had suffered losses, certainly, but nothing proportionate to the damage they'd inflicted. It was one of the most lopsided armored victories of the entire Western European campaign. Word of the tactics used at Aricourt spread through the American armored forces. Tank commanders visited the 4th Armored Division to observe and learn. After-action reports circulated. The problem was that these reports also reached senior officers and staff planners who were horrified by the ammunition expenditure figures. The official response was to emphasize ammunition discipline and fire control. Unofficially, everyone who had seen marching firework kept using it. This created a strange duality in American armored doctrine for the rest of the war. The official training materials and manuals continued to emphasize traditional gunnery techniques, but the actual tactics used by successful tank units increasingly incorporated elements of marching fire or similar aggressive mobile firing techniques. There was official doctrine, and then there was what actually worked, and they weren't always the same thing. The Ordnance Department's concerns about ammunition weren't resolved so much as overwhelmed by American industrial production. By late 1904, the United States was producing war material at such a staggering rate that local shortages could be addressed relatively quickly. The logistical system adapted. Supply officers learned to anticipate higher ammunition usage by successful tank units and adjusted their deliveries accordingly. The system flexed to accommodate the reality on the ground, even if the official policy hadn't changed. It's worth examining why marching fire didn't become universal, despite its success. Part of the reason was that it required specific conditions to work optimally. You needed relatively open terrain where you could maneuver at speed. You needed crews who were skilled enough to load and fire while moving, which took training and experience. You needed an enemy that fought in a predictable, doctrine-bound manner. Against Japanese forces in the Pacific, for example, marching fire would have been less useful because Japanese anti-tank tactics relied more on ambush and close assault than on tank versus tank duels. The tactic also had limitations that became apparent when American forces encountered different situations. In the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1904, marching fire was less effective because the terrain and weather restricted mobility. The dense forests and poor visibility made speed less advantageous. American tank units in the Bulge often had to fight from static positions or in conditions where traditional gunnery methods were more appropriate. Similarly, as the war moved into Germany itself in 1945, American tanks increasingly fought in urban environments or in heavily fortified positions where marching fire offered fewer advantages. You couldn't charge through a German city at 15 miles per hour, firing your main gun. Well, you could, but you'd probably hit a building or drive into a bomb crater. The tactic worked best in the kind of mobile, open warfare that characterized the drive across France. But in the contexts where it did work, marching fire was devastatingly effective. The kill ratios achieved by units that employed it were significantly better than those that didn't. Casualty rates among crew members were lower, mission success rates were higher. Every metric that mattered in combat improved. When American tanks used aggressive mobile firing tactics against German armor, the German response to marching fire is interesting because they never really developed an effective counter. German doctrine was so thoroughly built around deliberate, aimed fire from prepared positions that adapting to this kind of aggressive American tactics proved difficult. Individual German tank crews developed workarounds. Some learned to fire at the ground in front of advancing American tanks, hoping that the splash of dirt and debris would force them to slow down or change course. Others tried to predict where the American tank would be rather than where it was, leading their shots to account for target movement. But these were individual adaptations, not doctrinal changes. The Wehrmacht in late 1904 and early 1945 was stretched too thin, suffering from too many problems, to completely retrain their tank forces in new tactics. They were dealing with fuel shortages, personnel shortages, air superiority that gave the Allies complete control of the skies, and strategic situations that were increasingly desperate. Adapting to American tank tactics was low on the priority list when the Eastern Front was collapsing and the Western Front was being pushed back into Germany. There's also evidence that German tankers, even when they understood what the Americans were doing, struggled with the psychological adjustment. The Wehrmacht had built its reputation on technical excellence and tactical precision. Marching fire was neither technical nor precise. It was crude, aggressive, and relied on overwhelming firepower rather than skillful gunnery. For German crews who had been trained to take pride in their marksmanship, it was galling to be defeated by what appeared to be brute force tactics. American crews had no such hang-ups. The Sherman tank was inferior to German armor in almost every technical specification. American tankers knew this. They'd known it since North Africa. They had developed a healthy respect bordering on fear of panthers and tigers. Any tactic that gave them an edge was welcomed enthusiastically. If that meant firing 3 times as many shells and letting the supply officers worry about logistics, so be it. Better to be alive and low on ammunition than dead with full ammo racks. The aftermath of Aricourt and the spread of marching fire techniques across American armored units contributed to the growing effectiveness of American armor in the final months of the war. By early 1945, American tank units were conducting operations with a level of skill and aggression that matched or exceeded their German counterparts. The technical inferiority of the Sherman was still a factor, but it mattered less when American crews were fighting smarter and more aggressively. Captain Jimmy Leach himself continued to serve with distinction for the rest of the war. His company remained one of the most successful tank units in the 4th Armored Division. Leach survived the war, which is worth noting because tank commanders had a horrifyingly high casualty rate. Leadership from the front in an armored unit meant being in the thick of combat constantly. The fact that Leach made it through speaks to both his skill and his luck. After the war, the U.S. Army conducted extensive reviews of armored tactics and doctrine. The debates about marching fire continued in professional military journals and staff colleges. Some officers argued it had been a one-time success based on specific circumstances. Others believed it represented a genuine innovation in armored warfare. The official position gradually shifted to acknowledge that aggressive mobile tactics had proven valuable, though the specific technique of continuous fire while advancing at high speed remained controversial. The evolution of tank technology eventually made the marching fire debate somewhat obsolete. Post-war tanks incorporated better stabilization systems that allowed accurate fire while moving. The M26 Pershing, which began arriving in Europe in early 1945, had improved gunnery systems. By the time the M48 Patton tank entered service in the 1950s, firing accurately while moving was standard capability rather than an improvised tactic. Modern main battle tanks can engage targets with high accuracy while traveling at considerable speeds, thanks to sophisticated stabilization and fire control systems. But in 1944, with the equipment and technology available, marching fire represented a genuine tactical innovation that emerged from the practical needs of combat rather than from theoretical planning. It was a solution to a real problem, developed by men who needed to stay alive and kill enemy tanks without getting killed themselves. The fact that it was officially discouraged while simultaneously being widely used says something interesting about military organizations and their relationship to innovation. The story of marching fire also illustrates the tension between different parts of a military organization. Combat units care about winning battles and surviving. Support units care about sustainability and logistics. Staff officers care about doctrine and standardization. These different perspectives aren't wrong. They're all necessary, but they don't always align, and when they conflict, someone has to make a decision about which priority matters most. In the case of marching fire, the decision was effectively made by the tank crews themselves. They saw what worked, they adopted it, and they kept using it regardless of official policy. In a volunteer army fighting a war with clear moral justification, there was a limit to how much the institution could enforce compliance with tactics that seemed to get people killed. The crews had agency, and they used it. The broader lesson here is about military adaptation and learning. Armies that can learn and adapt during wartime tend to win. Armies that remain rigid and doctrinaire tend to lose. The American military in World War II was far from perfect, but it had a capacity for adaptation that served it well. When something worked, even if it violated doctrine, there was usually room to incorporate it. The process wasn't always smooth or quick, but it happened. The German military, despite its reputation for excellence, was actually less adaptive than often believed. German doctrine was sophisticated and effective, but it was also somewhat rigid. When the Wehrmacht encountered situations that their doctrine didn't address well, they often struggled to adapt quickly. This became more pronounced as the war went on, and Germany's strategic situation deteriorated. By 1944, the German military was fighting a defensive war with shrinking resources, which left little room for experimentation or innovation. American forces, conversely, were on the offensive with expanding resources. They could afford to try new things. They could afford to waste ammunition if it meant winning battles more decisively. This fundamental difference in strategic situations shaped how each military approached tactical innovation. The Americans could experiment with marching fire because they had the industrial base to support it. The Germans couldn't respond in kind because they didn't have the resources to match American ammunition expenditure, even if they had wanted to. The final count of German tanks destroyed using marching fire and related aggressive tactics is impossible to determine precisely. The figure of 3,000 is an estimate based on cumulative after-action reports from American armored units that documented using these techniques. It includes tanks destroyed by the 4th Armored Division at Aricourt and elsewhere, as well as kills by other units in Patton's Third Army and in other American armies that adopted similar tactics. What is certain is that American tank units became significantly more effective in the final year of the war, and aggressive mobile firing techniques were a major factor in that improvement. Whether you call it marching fire specifically, or just describe it as more aggressive armored tactics generally, something changed in how American tanks fought, and that change led to better results. The men who pioneered these techniques, Jimmy Leach and others like him, were solving problems in real time with lives on the line. They weren't conducting laboratory experiments or war games. They were fighting for survival against an enemy that had better equipment and more experience. The fact that they found solutions, implemented them, and achieved success speaks to the kind of practical innovation that happens in combat when the stakes are existential. The fact that their solutions were officially discouraged while being unofficially adopted reveals the complexity of military organizations. No institution, no matter how large or well organized, is monolithic. There are always competing interests, different perspectives, and spaces where practice diverges from policy. In wartime, those gaps often matter a great deal. The army that can tolerate beneficial divergence from doctrine while maintaining overall cohesion has an advantage. Marching fire was never going to be officially endorsed as the preferred method of tank gunnery because it violated too many principles that logistics officers and planners held dear. But it didn't need to be officially endorsed. It needed to work, and it needed to spread through the informal networks that connect combat units. Both of those things happened. Tank commanders talked to each other, crews shared lessons learned, successful tactics replicated themselves through observation and imitation. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, American armored forces had traveled a long way from the green units that had struggled in North Africa. They had learned through brutal experience what worked and what didn't. They'd adapted their tactics, their training, and their approach to armored warfare. They had overcome the technical deficiencies of their equipment through superior logistics, better intelligence, air superiority, and tactical innovation. Marching fire was one piece of that larger puzzle. It wasn't the only reason American armor succeeded, but it was a significant factor. It represented a willingness to question established doctrine when that doctrine wasn't working. It represented the practical ingenuity of men who refused to die because a manual said they should fight a certain way. It represented the gap between theory and practice that exists in every military operation and which successful armies learn to navigate. The story also serves as a reminder that military history is full of forgotten innovations and tactics that were once crucial but have faded from memory. Marching fire isn't taught at West Point. It doesn't feature prominently in histories of World War II. Most books about the European campaign mention it briefly, if at all. Yet, for the men who were there, who used it and survived because of it, the tactic was the difference between life and death. Captain Jimmy Leach and his crews didn't set out to revolutionize armored warfare. They just wanted to stop getting shot at by German tanks that had every technical advantage. The solution they found, firing while moving at high speed, seemed crazy to everyone who hadn't tried it. It seemed wasteful. It seemed reckless. It seemed like exactly the kind of thing that would get you killed. Instead, it kept them alive. It killed German tanks by the dozen. It contributed to decisive American victories in critical battles. And it was banned, officially discouraged, and mostly forgotten by history. But for a crucial period in the fall and winter of 1904, as American armies pushed across France and into Germany, there were tank crews who broke every rule in the book and won their battles because of it. That's the real story of marching fire. Not that it was perfect or that it solved every problem, but that when conventional wisdom wasn't working, someone was willing to try something different and see what happened. What happened was, they won. What happened was they survived. And what happened was the army that benefited from their innovation spent more time worrying about ammunition supplies than celebrating the tactic that was winning battles. That's military bureaucracy for you. But the men in the tanks knew the truth. The men who went home when the war ended knew which tactics worked. And decades later, we can look back at the records and see what they accomplished. Even if it was never quite official, never quite approved, and never quite what the manual said to do. Retry Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.